Let's see. We are live, I think. I hope. All right. Well, I think we'll pretty much just get this rolling. I'm as I said, sort of backstage, Rom. I am absolutely delighted to be able to sit down and chat with you. I think that your work is sort of very comparable to what I feel like is the gold standard of comics in that sort of Vertigo age. But before we get into it, just to start off, how is everything? How are you doing under the current circumstances?
Yeah, things are all right. Quite busy, unintentionally so. I'm still discovering my limits and my scheduling capabilities in terms of the kind of work that I'm doing. But it's been a busy time so far, and honestly, I haven't had the time to really reflect on the lockdown and stuff.
Hmm.
It's been almost conducive to just sitting at my table and typing. Um,
I I suppose
yeah,
that's one small benefit to a pandemic, huh?
Yeah. I mean, it certainly increases the amount of time I spend at the desk. I don't know if it increases my creative productivity. We'll see.
Well, here's hoping, right?
Yeah.
So from what I understand, just doing some basic research, so you started off as a chemical engineer, and you were working down in Philly for a while before you decided to go back to India for a little bit.
Mhm.
And what I really appreciate about that is that I'm sort of a similar background. I actually studied molecular and cellular biology for 3 years
Mhm.
um, at the University of Connecticut before I realized that I really wanted to write and pivoted.
Sure.
Um, and so I wonder, do you feel like your background in chemical engineering and the way you've sort of been conditioned to think and process things has affected the way that you tell and consider your stories?
Yeah, to an extent, I think it has quite a few influences on the way I look at writing. I tend to be quite analytical about it.
Mm.
So I think that part comes from the engineering side of it. But I also tend to be very aware of needing to let go of that analytical side of my brain. And I think
Mm.
that also comes from the chemical engineering side of it, where
Mm.
um, I did a master's in material science, surrounded myself with people who were PhDs, theorists, and more scientists than engineers really. And there comes a point where you have to let go of the logic of why and try to make leaps of
Mm.
understanding. And I think that is true to both art and science. um, Other things, I traveled a lot for my work when I was working as an engineer, and I think the travel certainly influences my writing and the way I think about the world and the way I think about stories.
Mm.
And I suppose, if anything, the 8 years I spent studying chemical engineering taught me that I can do something I don't like particularly
Mm.
well if I put enough time and effort into it.
Mm.
So, you will always come across times where you're doing something you really like, but it involves doing something tedious, like
Mm.
mailing out 300 copies of a book
Mm.
to your backers, for example. It's not the most entertaining thing, carrying hundreds of books to a post office and mailing them out. But um, if the chemical engineering taught me anything, it is to say that, okay, sometimes you need to put in elbow grease if you're gonna do something successfully.
Yeah, yeah, and you catch a lot of that, I think, in the work. I mean, when you talk about the travel, I think that brings a very particular diversity of thought and
Mm,
the sort of stories that you like to tell. I know, obviously, you're bringing a bit of your own sort of cultural mythology into a lot of the work
sure.
that you're doing, and particularly what I like a lot, and it seems to be very sort of specific about uh, a lot of the work that I've read from you is that you're bringing that sort of cultural consciousness to your work in a sense that you're not as much moralizing mythology as I feel like we do in the Western world, particularly,
Sure.
and I'm wondering what sort of role that plays in the way that you process story or character.
I mean, specifically in terms of mythology, I think it's a matter of travel, but also it's a matter of just reading with that kind of analytical mindset. And you think about it, like it's not the mythology that is moralized; it's really religion that takes mythology and moralizes it.
Mm,
Mythologies are it's just stories, and I think the ones that really sustain and become mythological epics, if you will,
mhm,
uh, become that way because they're good stories, and so
mm,
necessarily they have gray zones and fallible characters, and good characters who made bad decisions, or bad characters who showed a glimpse of good. And I think that is common to a lot of stories and a lot of mythologies. So I tend to be very clear on where mythology comes from and where theology comes from.
mm,
And so, and especially, given my cultural background, it's very easy in India to conflate the two things, because
mm,
um, India is one of those, I think, one of the few cultures in the world where, especially Hindu religion, is one of those few places where the mythology has stayed as a
mm,
central and important part of the religion, if you will.
mm.
Um, so yeah, so that's on that specific aspect of it. But I think what the traveling does for me really is it underlines the fact that fundamentally people care about similar things, even if they're from very disparate places.
Mm.
And I think somewhere in there, in trying to understand why, a bunch of kids sitting in India who've never traveled outside of the country will still pay, XYZ amount of money to get into a theater and watch Black Panther and
Mm.
celebrate Wakanda, despite, having no idea of what these places are actually like outside. But kids enjoyed that story and they loved it and understood it. And I think there's something uniquely beautiful about stories being able to form that kind of cross-cultural bridge.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and I think that is important to understand.
yeah. I agree. There's definitely there is a connective tissue that I feel like kind of runs throughout the globe, and a lot of that does come from storytelling. I mean, I think more natively than anything, human beings are storytellers, and although the
Sure.
sort of methodology or the vehicle by which we sort of explore those connective threads may change, just due
Right.
to a number of different sort of sociological and at times geographical factors, there is something that makes things like you were talking about regarding something like Black Panther so prevalent and so appealing, is because at its core, it is something that we can all relate to varying capacities. And
Right.
I think that's one of the things that I like a lot about your work, is that you you like to bring this sort of non-Western convention into like comic books, which are traditionally like a Western storytelling medium,
Sure.
and it's a big part of why I think you've established such a unique voice for
Mm.
yourself, um, and the sort of way that at least as a reader and my interaction with your work shows this different sort of trajectory of thought.
Mm. In what sense do you mean trajectory of thought?
So so I'll talk about something like Blue and Green, because
Yeah.
that's something that first of all everybody out there should read or be reading or check out, because it is brilliant on multiple levels. But the way you sort of consider the very mundane life of the protagonist, Eric Dieter, and it's almost like, I don't know if eulogize is the word, but he almost sort of eulogizes this life that he never had, and it
Right.
approaches that sort of melancholy, reflective um, angle on a much sort of grander scheme. I mean, you bring in elements of horror and like almost fantasy to a level, and I think that the way you're able to make it feel so sort of simultaneously pared down and intimate while being this sort of grand horror is really interesting. And you don't, I feel like I don't often see, at least, that that sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like this level of simultaneity to such a degree, I should say.
Right. I mean, I think to an extent that's more of a comics thing. I think I don't think particularly that has anything to do with my cultural background,
Mm,
but I think it's more of a comics thing where people have ideas, or there are popular ideas of how horror works in comics,
mm,
and for the longest time, the most successful kind of horror in comics has been this kind of schlocky. Oh,
mm,
look, here's a monster on a page, which is great. I mean, I don't put that aside, but that's not the only kind of horror that works. And I
mm,
think the things that people appreciate in horror changes, through history, through time. If you watched Frankenstein, the original Frankenstein today, you might not particularly feel like it's horror outside of, okay, there's a guy with some stitches on his head. Um, but also, you go back to the 80s, and you see like these outlandish, really lurid kind of special effects on the screen, and I don't think that works anymore in horror as well, unless you're
yeah.
trying to evoke that kind of nostalgia. So I think horror changes over time, um, and I don't think that has ever been reflected in comics, and until more recently.
Hmm.
And so Blue and Green was kind of my attempt at doing that, where I said, the real horror is in your mind. It doesn't have to be on the page. And that comes from, it's less about the guy pulling out his teeth on the page, and it's more about you going like, I understand why he's pulling out his tooth right now, and that's
Yeah.
horrific. And it's possible to do that in comics, and I like stories with that kind of subtlety and nuance and subtext. So
Yeah, I think really what makes it all the more gripping is this sense of existential horror as opposed to like this tangible horror, like you were saying, because it feels so much more personally involved than it does physically involved, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense.
sure, yeah, yeah. I mean, it is what I wanted to do. I wanted to kind of steer clear of the jump scares and the
Mm.
kind of gore on the page, um, which I'm absolutely a fan of. I've read my share of Rights and EC Comics and all that.
Mhm.
But I wanted to do something that was much more subtle, where the horror of it was really circumstantial and existential, as you said. And it's about the lengths to which you can push someone, or someone will push themselves. And that in itself is horrific. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think something like that becomes all the more appealing to, it's hard to frame a generation, but this sort of current generation, or the current sort of young adult to adult uh, sort of space, because we're all sort of looking at life as this very sort of harrowing um, sort of horror that expects so much of us, and when we don't sort of fulfill
Mm.
what we feel like are the requirements or the asks of us, it's haunting in many ways. And that, to me, I guess, with my experience with Blue and Green, that comes through a lot in the work.
Yeah. I mean, I think I saw this as part of a Warren Ellis documentary, where they're talking about the fact that the mid 80s were filled with so much science fiction about, jetpacks and floating cars and teleportation devices in everyone's home, that the the 2000s, the 20th century, 21st century, um, they all feel like you're haunted by a vision of a future that you never quite achieved.
Mm,
And so I think that is a cultural artifact, among younger people today as well. Is, you know we were expecting to be teleporting to each other's houses, and we were expecting to be flying by in floating cars. Instead, here we are trying to scrounge up enough loose change to get my next iPhone.
yeah, yeah.
And I think there's something sad there. There's something that we culturally mourn, the loss of this kind of hopeful future that we had at
Mm,
one point. Um, traveling to the moon was supposed to be amazing.
Mm.
Instead, here we are in 2021 going like, oh crap, we should have grappled with trying to save this planet instead. And so, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to dig into there. And if we linger on it too far, we'll get into my melancholies about humanity. But no, I agree with you. I think there's a vein of horror there that didn't exist probably pre 90s.
Yeah, that suffuses a lot into the work, and going deeper into Blue and Green, I do kind of want to talk a little bit about your collaborative process with Anand. Is that the proper pronunciation?
It's Anand.
Anand.
Yeah,
Um, because there's a lot of sort of surrealist elements in the visual design, whether it's the layout or what they're doing with camera and things of that nature. And I'm really curious because I've seen you and you have a visual acumen for drawing and for
sure.
designing. So I'm wondering how hands-on you might have been in laying out the page or setting up the shots, and the I would say the sort of interaction, the give and take that you had collaborating with them.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think I think as time has gone on, I've gotten less sort of modest about wanting to get my visual acumen dirty with these comics, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And some artists appreciate it, some artists don't. Uh, I tend to collaborate, at least on the creator owned stuff, with people who don't mind that. You know, I always make this comparison oddly right after we finish talking about Blue and Green. Um, I always say that making comics is like making music in a band, and you don't get in a band and you go like, "Hey, vocalist, your job is to sing. My job is to play the guitar. His job is to drum." Now, sometimes the vocalist is going to come in and go like, "Hey, if you did a solo at this point, a really high solo, I think that will pair well." Or the guitarist is going to go to the drummer and go like, "Hey, if you lay
Mm-hmm.
off the bass pedal for a while, I can do something interesting here." And so I think that kind of collaborative interaction needs to be there in comics to put out a book that feels like a song, like one
Mm-hmm.
thing rather than four different people working with each other.
Yeah.
And I would like to think that this is true of all of my collaborative work, especially on the creator-owned side. On the work for hire side, I think rightly so. Some artists have worked a certain way in their careers, and so they tend to want that kind of freedom for themselves. But I've equally been surprised by my collaborators, Mike Perkins, for example.
Mm.
Thank you, Mike Perkins, for example, who's very open, who loves it when I send him oddly scrawled doodles on Facebook and go like, "Hey, this is what I was thinking." And so I think it depends on how open your artists are for that kind of stuff. But certainly on the creator owned book, I have no need to hold back any of it. And I go like, look, when I get an artist on board, look, I'm used to sketching stuff. I'm used to having layout ideas, and I'm going to send them to you. They're not meant to muscle in on your vision for the book. They're meant to be, this is what's in my head. If you can come up with something that you think works better, I'm very happy to discuss it. And so that's kind of been my general collaborative philosophy on most of my creator owned stuff. Especially on Blue and Green, it was a bit weirder because then I had worked on Gravity's Wall at this point. And awesome. It's my favorite Miles Davis song as well. Actually, the reason I named the book Blue and Green was because I kept telling people that there was something oddly haunting about the song, and no one agreed with me. And I was like, fine, I'll write a story to make you understand why. But with Blue and Green, the way we worked was, as I sent pages to Anand, he would come back to me with layout ideas and art. And at some point, that collaborative process got to the point where we were pretty much talking daily about pages. Like, hey, Can we do this here? Can we put this here? Can you use this style? Um, and it just started making sense for me to write the thing one page at a time. And so it became this thing almost like jazz, call and response, where I would write a page, we'd discuss it, he'd come back with the art, I'd look at that one and go like, okay, next page. And so yeah, I think that shows in the book as well. It's a little bit of a nerve-wracking way to write because you're never quite sure of what the big picture feels like. But it's an interesting experiment. I don't know if I would do that too often.
Yeah, I feel like that's sort of taking the osmotic experience of comic book collaboration and taking it to the next level.
Yeah.
But in all fairness, I think it bore a lot of fruit in that, in Blue and Green in particular, just because, again, just the level of intimacy. And there was, it's one of those books that it takes me, when I reread it in preparation for this conversation, it took me longer to read because not in a sense that the book is slowing me down, but because I know that there's so much to unpack behind every little bit. And I love that. I secretly love when a comic or a graphic novel takes me a long time to read, because you can feel the consideration and the pensivity sort of really flooding through your eyes and into your brain. And it just makes you kind of sit and think. And so, yeah, that's just a long-winded way for me to say that I think the book is brilliant on pretty much every level.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the kind of storytelling I enjoy. I enjoy stuff that reads in layers, and then each time you go back to it, you find something else to think about when you're reading it. So hopefully I endeavor to create the kind of things that I like. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's the common saying that you have to create for you above all else.
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes that's what makes the best art in my experience, at least.
Sure. I mean, I read somewhere that people keep saying like, oh, art is communication, and really it's not. Because you're expressing, you're not communicating. And the communication is an incidental result of trying to make commercial art because you want to get paid, so you want other people to come and read it, and there's value in that. But really, if you're genuinely if you're generally concerned with making art, I think personally it pays for me to think of it as expression. I'm trying to put down something on paper that I am interested in, that I want to say, that I'm exploring. Often, people express frustration with my work sometimes, going like, there's so many questions and no answers. I'm like, yeah, because I'm not interested in answers. I'm interested in I'm asking these questions. Sometimes I don't know the answers, but I'm asking and exploring these questions through the lives of these characters that I'm putting on page. And so it is genuinely more of an expression than a communication for me.
Yeah, I really like that sort of methodology to considering art, and obviously particularly pertaining to storytelling, because I've always sort of in a way considered storytelling a sort of abstract conversation between the reader and the writer, and or the storyteller. And it is that it's a conversation in so much as there is a transfer or a back and forth of information, but it's not one-to-one, and it is never it's never true in the sense that it's the same dialogue that you're going to have with somebody else reading the same exact thing.
Yeah, I mean, if from a criticism point of view, you subscribe to the whole death of the author thing, then surely from a creative point of view, you must subscribe to the whole death of the reader thing. So, I mean, that's how I think about it. I don't particularly think it's a conversation. I think it becomes a conversation once the book is off your desk and on a printing press. But until it leaves your desk, it is not a conversation. It is an expression. It is a vomiting of thought onto a medium.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and in the best way possible. I think I really like that. It definitely, I feel like I'm going to sit down after this conversation and really think about that for a good minute. So
yeah. I mean, it's one of those things that you can endlessly think about and debate, I suppose. But I find it at this point in my creative career, find it useful to think of it that way.
Mm. Yeah. Hey, if it works, I mean, you're generating such great work. And speaking of some of the great work you're coming out with, I know it hasn't yet come out, but I do want to sort of give the folks at home a primer for the Many Deaths of Layla Starr as a means to get them to go pick it up, because you were
Mhm.
kind enough to let me read that first issue. And without giving it so many spoilers or leading somebody on too far, if I were to sort of try to distill it down to a couple of words, it makes me think of Miyazaki meets Gaiman in many many ways. Um, and
Sure.
so and so on that, and I think Gaiman in multiple facets. One on the sort of Sandman spectrum, and also on the American Gods spectrum.
Sure.
So I'm wondering what sort of inspired you, obviously without spoiling anything, to tell that story. Um, and this follow-up question is also sort of multifaceted in much for the body of your work, and it is that artists are often kind of making themselves very vulnerable when they're telling a story. They're putting a piece of themselves to some capacity in there, and I'm wondering what specifically about Layla Starr sort of contains that for you.
Yeah, I mean, as far as what inspired it, I don't know. To be honest, I've been thinking about telling a story about death, kind of set in India, since before I started writing comics. So
Mm.
it's just been there in the back of my mind. Um, I'd totally write a Dead Man series. Um, but yeah, it's been in the back of my mind for a while. So I suppose it's hard for me to pinpoint where that inspiration came from.
Hmm.
Um, Obviously, all of these things, more than American Gods, I suppose. Things like Good Omens probably has a bigger influence on the thing. There's also a very Pratchettian vibe to that first issue,
Mm.
um, I think. And as far as the Gaiman influence and the inspiration from that goes, I answered this on a different interview before, that people are like, Gaiman's already done the whole death, high cost of living personified, and I agree with that, and I think part of the inspiration for me is to go like, isn't it fascinating how death is such a different cultural artifact
Mm.
depending on where you go. Like, some cultures think of it as this terrible and bad thing, and literally cultures right next door will go like, it's a thing to be celebrated.
Yeah.
um, uh, there's a deeply spiritual aspect to it in a lot of cultures. In other cultures, they believe it is the end of the spirit.
Mm.
So yeah. I mean, there's so much to dig into there, and I felt like part of the thing I do with the stories that are based in India and around culture that I'm familiar with, is also to provide a window into things that you don't get to see when, like Danny Boyle makes the story set in India.
Mm. Yeah.
Like I think Indian stories tend to become, and even if the intention isn't so, it tends to become very stereotypical in that, oh, I have to make a story about poverty. Okay, but poor people also have ambition and dreams, and they want to be rappers, and
Mm.
they have they make mistakes, and they do interesting things, and it doesn't all have to be about this thing,
Mm.
that you feel is a cultural artifact because that is what you have seen as an outsider. So I
Mm.
think part of what I try to do with Indian stories that I write is to present something as an insider and go like,
Mm.
yeah, I know India is this like super religious place, and there's temples everywhere, and you know, it's supposed to be the place you come to find yourself. But there's also this absurdity about religion in India, and I
Mhm.
explore some of that with this book.
Mm.
And I think death and the rituals surrounding it are very, very private matter, culturally, when it comes to Hindu religion and Hindu funerals. And I never read a book where any of that was visually represented.
Mm.
And so I think you'll find that in the book as well. That oh, this is what it looks like when there's a funeral in India. Huh, that's
Mm.
strange. and there are cultural meanings and beautiful human things behind why some of those things are done. So
Yeah. Yeah, that 100% to me really bled through into this first issue, because for a story that's so sort of conscious about death and about the sort of relationship that humanity has with death, it's so filled with life and personality, and that comes through a lot in the sort of visual design. And I just I love that. Again, you present this really interesting dichotomy in a lot of your work, and it comes through particularly with Layla Starr because of the way I think it considers our mortality. And one sort of, just sort of in a way going back to an earlier part of the conversation where we were talking about the connective tissue that exists throughout the worlds.
yeah,
Just based on my exposure, that cyclical nature of life and death really reminded me of, in some small way, the Norse mythology. And it
yeah.
does go to show you that although, they're an entire continent away, there is that sort of sinew that binds us all together to some
Yeah,
capacity.
interestingly, and you're gonna these are the things that fascinate me. The Norse god of death is Ymir, and
Mhm.
the Indian god of death is Yama.
Oh.
So they're literally one alphabet apart,
Mm.
in at least in terms of name. And it's we're talking about two of the oldest still surviving pantheons in the world, right?
Mhm.
So I think there's bound to be a lot of cross cultural bleed. I was reading this for my now infamously cancelled Thor book, but I was reading this bit about Proto-European, Indo-European migrations, and so the idea that the Norse mythology and the Norse pantheon, the Indian pantheon, are just migratory reflections of each other
Mm.
is also very interesting because there's lots of commonality beyond Yama. You know, Zeus leads that pantheon with lightning in his hand, and Indra leads this pantheon with lightning in his hand. There's so many. There's a Poseidon there. There's a Indra
Mm.
lives under the water, sleeps on a bed of snakes, has a trident. So there's so many commonalities. It's super interesting to think about.
Yeah, and that also, it just having that conversation makes me think a lot about these savage shores as well, and the sort of it's okay. So this is like just a totally non-distilled thought. So I hope I'm able to communicate it in a way that is coherent. But the first thing that comes to mind is a sort of Pangea, and it is that there is a sort of central place that we're coming from, but as the geographically, or geologically I should say, the world is sort of migrated outward, those ideas also sort of follow with it. And in so much as the geology is changing, the ideas are sort of being molded to those new contexts that are created, but still very sort of central.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that sort of great Pangea that you talk about is why stories work.
Mm.
And I think that at least if there isn't a geographical one anymore, there is at least a an empirical one, a one of experience that you know my experiences are limited to my lifetime, and yet somehow I'm also part of the experience of humanity, where the experience of those that have come before me is greatly impinges upon how I experience the world today. And so surely stories somewhere become part of that
Yeah.
thing, if you will.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And so, we got into a couple bits of work also for anybody listening. Go make sure that you're ordering The Many Deaths of Layla Starr. It comes out
Well, the
April.
FOC is already done, but
Okay.
it comes out on April 21st. So if you have not ordered pre FOC, go to your shop and buy it before someone else does.
Get on it. Send that baby back to press, because it deserves it. And I kind of want to get into a little bit of a side topic here, because we were talking a lot about sort of maybe not one for one, but varying equivalencies between comics and music, which I've
Yeah.
always found fascinating. And again, although it's not a one-to-one comparison, I've always equated comics to being the jazz of literature, just in this sort of diasporic influences that it pulls into the format in a way that I don't know any other format to do. Um,
Sure.
and how it sort of correlates is, and this is much more, I guess, hearsay, but in your work, you can tell the story is different, not only in this sort of specific context and in the tone, but in this sort of rhythmic value that I feel like each of your stories that I've read has. Am I just being sort of preachy, or does that make sense?
I mean, I don't know that it necessarily comes from where you're attributing it to, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm certainly obsessed with the idea of reading rhythm and storytelling pace and how that relates to visual design in a comic book. Um, I think there is certainly a metronomic quality to a lot of the work. Sometimes it comes from me. Sometimes it comes from um, the artist. Like in case of Many Deaths of Layla Starr, a lot of that comes from Felipe going. I want to use widescreen storytelling. I want to use wide panels to tell the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so once he did that, though, I was like, okay, well, that's the rhythm we're telling the story at. Fine, I'll play the rest of my song to that rhythm.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where the whole comics as a band thing comes in. Um, and so, yeah, I agree. I'm obsessed with reading rhythm and pacing in a comic, and certainly that has its musical equivalences.
Mm. Yeah, for sure. I'm also curious because, I've sort of speculated as to what I feel like some of your influences may be in your storytelling, and I know those can often come from different sources, whether it's literary, comics, film, so on and so forth. So I'm wondering, at least at this current stage in your career and in your life, because I know the sort of intensity from which you pull inspiration will change
Yeah.
depending on where you are. But I'm curious right now. Um, can you give us a sort of snapshot at who or what is really inspiring you to create at the moment?
I mean, at the moment, it's a particularly bad time to ask me this question because I'm just tired of doing all this writing, sat at home, locked in a room.
I'm sorry.
Kind of like nothing is inspiring me right now. No, I'm kidding. Um, I mean, I've always found inspiration and ideas from all kinds of media. Really,
Mm,
um, part of it has been film. Film certainly very influential for me because, and I don't think a lot of people know this, but when I talk to my editors at DC, like when I was back in India, I didn't grow up reading DC Marvel stuff.
mhm,
I grew up watching the cartoons,
mm,
um, which is odd because the cartoons came out a long time before my time as well. But in India, we got all that content like a decade later, so it was perfect for me.
mm,
Um, and so the animated universe stuff was more influential for me, and so a lot of my storytelling comes from there. And I think that has continued even with the creator-owned work, where animation, film, and TV stories told in that format certainly have been very influential. And then with time, I particularly try to pick up influence from unusual places because I think, frankly, that's where you get a unique voice from. Is to try and do something with an influence that doesn't necessarily lend itself to the medium that you're talking about. Um,
mm.
and oddly, I've found that a lot of people have tried before me. So, I love Paul Auster, Michael Chabon as authors, and Michael Chabon's done comics as well. He's a huge comics nerd, from what I hear.
Mm.
But that kind of literary influence, where the storytelling, the plot really is not a matter of obsession as much as character and
Mm.
the words that you're using and the subtext that exists between those words. I kind of try to bring a lot of that into my comics writing, certainly of the creator own stuff.
Mm.
And then the more abstract structural leanings of people like Calvino, Borges, who are all, from what I hear, obsessed with the idea of comics. I think Calvino wrote at one point a script that could have been just a comic book script. He wrote
Wow.
an entire story just as a comic book script. So yeah, it's surprising the kind of influence that this medium has, and shocking really that it hasn't, gone beyond its kind of niche place in literary media, if you will. But all the greats, anyone who says, comics are for kids, like Calvino was obsessed with comics. Borges was obsessed with comics. Anyone who says comics are for kids, Bjarke Engels, one of the kind of cutting edge architects in the world today, is only an architect because at some point he decided to stop trying to make comics and go study architecture. So yeah, we're everywhere. We're around you, comics creators.
Yeah. And I mean, it even bleeds through into sort of more popular media. Obviously, Neil Gaiman made the
Sure.
transition. From what I understand, George R.R. Martin was very influenced by early Stan
Well,
Lee.
he also wrote comics. I don't think they were particularly good ones, but he certainly he wrote comics. And I've read R.R. Martin's comics as well. Neil Gaiman actually didn't transition from comics. He started off in prose, and he.
Because I was going to say, I know he was a journalist of sorts at one point, right?
He was a short story writer. He wrote short fiction, and he was a journalist at one point. But he also wrote short fiction in magazines before his comic book work was published. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember hearing him talk about how he used to particularly get picked up by more adult magazines to write stories in, which I found kind of peculiar and fitting to Neil Gaiman as a creative mind, because he's so he's very sort of far reaching, which is something that I definitely appreciate about him. Sure. But so I'm curious, because I've made claim of my hypothesis to you being inspired by sort of some earlier Vertigo works, and I'm wondering, one, is that the case, and two, are there any particular works that have really stuck with you over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's no secret. My entry into comics really was through Sandman, and I had read comics as a kid. I'd read some of the Marvel DC stuff as a kid, but largely my reading was, Phantom, Mandrake, and Lee Falk strips in Indian newspapers, and a lot of European comics like Tintin and Asterix, and some of the bande dessinée stuff as well. And so I only came to kind of mainstream. I don't even know if Vertigo would like to be called mainstream, but I came to. That was my mainstream, essentially. Those were the only comics I read. I didn't really read a lot of superhero stuff, even at that time. And I followed a very kind of, I think this is part of my chemical engineering training. I followed a very analytical route through comics. I read Sandman. I loved it. And I found everything Neil Gaiman had done. And I read all of it, including the prose stuff. And then I read somewhere that this guy called Alan Moore had recommended Neil to Karen Berger for his Vertigo kind of start. So I went like, okay, let me find what Alan Moore did. And then I read all of that. Then I read somewhere that this guy called Grant Morrison had criticized Alan Moore's work, and famously in some indie magazines. So I'm like, all right, let's see what Grant Morrison did. And I read all of that. And I kind of followed that Vertigo line and found Hellblazer by that time. And Hellblazer, for those who don't know, is just if you put aside the actual content, just go through the collected edition and look at all the authors and just read through all of them. That's pretty good comic book reading.
Yeah.
Like, I think it goes Delano, Ennis, Ellis, Azzarello, Moore, Gaiman, Andy Diggle at one point, Peter Milligan. Like, yeah, that's pretty much my gateway into comics. All of those people.
Yeah, I have not been shy about contending that the quote unquote British invasion of comics is probably the highest concentration of talent that the industry has ever seen at any given period in time.
Sure, I mean, but these things become apparent in hindsight,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
it's also a matter of people looking for patterns, but literary scenes are not a new thing.
Mm.
They've happened throughout history. Like great authors, great creators have always been in conversation in the neighborhood of each other, sometimes lovingly so, sometimes not so lovingly so. But
Yeah.
I mean, Twain and Bernard Shaw kept writing each other hate mail. So there you go. Yeah,
Well,
I mean, it's this great story. It's a great anecdote where Bernard Shaw had a play come out, and he sent a ticket to Twain, and he said, "Here's a pair of tickets, so you can bring along a friend if you have any." Right? And Twain wrote back, sent the tickets back. He said, "I'm afraid I can't make it on that evening, but I would love to come to a second screening if there is one." I
that's
mean, come
brilliant.
on.
That's, that's so good. I feel like out of the only modern equivalent I can think of is the Tarantino Spike Lee kind of debacle.
Sure, sure.
Although I think you can tell that at least I get the sense that Tarantino is actually a fan of Spike Lee, but because of the sort of animosity is kind of like, well, now I can't really show that as much.
Yeah,
But
it's a pity. I think you should be able to have creative animosity without it becoming personal.
yeah,
Because the
yeah,
creative animosity is where all the fun is.
that's true. That's 100% true. There is I mean, we're human, we are naturally sort of, I think in many ways instinctually prepared to compete with people for the things that we want.
Sure. I think
Whether
people
what
take themselves too seriously today. If the same thing had been the case, 20, 30 years before, I
mm,
mean, we might have had at some point, Duel at Dawn,
mm,
but I think there was a lot more room for creative differences, as evidenced by the great Moore Morrison debate.
mm.
Like, I don't think those two have gotten personal anywhere outside of actual writing and actual interviews, and it's always intelligent and it's always interesting to read. So
Mm. Yeah, you make a very good point. Kind of shifting directions too, because we've gotten into a lot of your awesome creator-owned stuff, which people need to go check out because obviously creator-owned doesn't always get the exposure that I feel it deserves. But I'd be remiss not to talk about the stuff that you're doing for DC right now because
mhm,
you're very involved over there at the moment.
mhm,
Um, and kind of shifting into Catwoman in particular because it was a title that I actually kind of went back retroactively and read what you had done before Future State because I had picked up the
mhm,
Future State, which,
mhm.
by the way, the Future State Catwoman I think is one of the best stories to come out of that era, that line. I don't
Thank
know.
you.
Um, it's just and I think that it also goes to show your bringing it back to the rhythm of it all, your awareness of pace and space that you had. Because
Mhm,
and I won't go too deep into this, but one of my major problems with Future State were that a lot of stories, you could tell that creators wanted to do something bigger, but they didn't quite understand the space that they had to tell it in. And what I
mhm,
liked about Catwoman in particular is because you knew that you had two issues. So you told a pretty tight heist story that was also very character driven and had a lot of personality with it. And obviously collaborating with somebody the likes of Otto Schmidt doesn't hurt either.
of course.
Um, but moving into Catwoman, I really liked the introduction of Father Valley,
Mhm,
and we talked a lot about the sort of vulnerability that an author or a creator will pour into their artwork, and I often feel like, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, that villains are usually the most curated additions to superhero stories because of the challenges that they present, both in story and sort of thematically. And I'm wondering what is that? What is in that case? What does Father Valley mean to you, and what sort of challenges does he present to both Selena and to us as the sort of reader?
I mean, on a sort of more functional level,
Mhm.
um, I think I think he's someone. that feels like a fitting sort of antithesis to Selena, in
Mm.
that, you know, neither of them have superpowers or whatever, you know, they don't have any metahuman abilities, at least none that we know of, and so it certainly feels like it is a contest of equals in that sense, um, and the idea is that they're both very intelligent operators, and so that really is kind of their power, if you will.
Hmm.
And so far, it certainly feels like they're both willing to put whatever is up for grabs for down as their stakes, if you will.
Mm.
So I just like the idea of Selena going up against someone who equally has plays like they have nothing to lose.
Mm.
Um, and then comes the kind of thematic counterpoint of Selena having this kind of very flexible moral compass, in that she knows her own sense of right and wrong, but she doesn't act to anyone else's ideas of what right and wrong is. And
Mhm.
then on the other side, you have this character who is impervious in terms of what he personally feels about one thing or the other, because everything he does is by this great other moral compass of the book that he holds, or of the God that he prays to. And so I think thematically that's an interesting argument to kind of get into.
Mm.
Um, but I'm also very aware that I'm writing about people who dress up in costumes and go out and beat each other up each night. So, um, you know, those things will find their way in, but it's about getting one relentless pursuer pursuing a relentless creature of the night, if you will. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I find that really interesting, obviously talking about the sort of flexibility of Selena's character, her morals, so on and so forth. Because you're exploring that sort of outside of her relationship with Bruce,
Mhm.
or at least from what I understand, it may come into play and be tangential, but tangential. And
Yeah.
I like that you're taking Selena and really focalizing on her, because she's an interesting character. Like you said, that flexible moral compass gives her a lot of leeway and a lot of space for some really interesting storytelling. And so I'm wondering, were you given sort of any pushback about leaving Bruce a little bit more on the sideline of the Selena equation, or was that sort of a, you know what, you go for it, let's do Selena as Selena Kyle rather than Selena as Bruce Wayne's girlfriend?
Yeah, I mean, that was my pitch. My
Mm.
pitch was, this character needs to be her own person, in her own book. Like, if you're gonna have a Catwoman book, it has to be about Catwoman. It can't be
Mm.
about Batman's girlfriend. You know,
Right.
and so, and I think, frankly, that is a disservice to her, for her to be treated as this kind of incidental interest for a bigger character. If you're gonna
Agreed.
if you're gonna if you're gonna write a character, you have to do the hard work. You have to dig into who she is for herself, not
Hmm.
into who she is for someone else. And so I also like the idea that the character is kind of going through that question. Like
Mm.
at the beginning of the run, she comes back, and she doesn't know who she is at this
Yeah.
point. And so she is discovering that, and starts off with this kind of big bang on that I'm the queen of Alley Town, which is a
Mm.
very Selena thing to do. I think is to go like, I don't know who I am. What do I do? I stomp down my boot with make the biggest sound possible.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, but I think we'll get into the repercussions of that, and kind of where that takes her, and what she ends up becoming because of it. And yeah, frankly, I think it makes the whole equation with Bruce a lot stronger, because now you have a character that chooses to be with another character, not has to
Mhm.
be with another character for
Mm.
for you know. And I think there's beauty and strength in that, where I believe that's how good relationships work. These are
Mm.
these are not people who need to be with each other. These are people who choose to be with each other.
Yeah. I love that mentality going into that relationship, because I feel oftentimes that the sort of tumult that those two experience in their intimacy is often just sort of played out for the sake of spectacle. And what I love
Mhm.
here is that you're actually in many ways still maintaining something that is a part of an 80-year continuity, but
Yeah.
is also ready to let these characters grow. Because and we alluded to this a little bit more earlier, but there is this, I think, trajectory for us as people who both tell and consume stories to move towards very sort of intimate conversations about character,
Mhm.
more so than larger plot or things like that, because we want that sort of relationship or connection that we can sort of make on our own front with those books, and it comes through a
I
lot.
mean, a big plot can sustain interest for 2 hours
Mhm,
without character. That's
mhm,
why movies fail. You've got big special effects and things happening and things crashing into each other. If you don't care about who's crashing into whom, um, there's no point to it.
mm,
And so I think the reason we get embroiled in these conversations of characters, because frankly, that's all that matters. Um, and I've had this conversation with other writers where sometimes they'll come to me like, I don't know how to figure out the story. And I say, okay, what's your story? And they're like, well, there's this space station that's floating out in space, and then this is happening. There's a planet kind of pulling it into its own gravity. Like, all that's great. What's the story? Just tell me
mm,
the character beats. And I think if you can't write a story about a guy who is breaking up with his girlfriend of XYZ or boyfriend of XYZ years and not pull in space invaders and aliens and sci-fi and fantasy into it, I think just as an exercise, leaving aside all the frills and just writing a very human focused, character focused story
mm,
is a very powerful and useful thing to do as a writer. Um,
mm.
and so yeah, my obsessions will always be with character. If you're ever gonna pick up a book of mine, and like I'm doing Justice League Dark now, and that thing is crazy. It's all over the place. There's stuff happening. There's 15 different plot lines. There's teams going all over the place. Um, but in the end, you care about it because of the characters, and so there is
Mm.
a important character through line through all of it.
Yeah, you see that a lot in your work, because one of the biggest, I think, compliments that I can give about what you do, particularly in the non-creator owned space when you're playing with others' toys, quote unquote, is that you have a very intimate understanding of personality, of gesture, and of their sort of individual cadence when they speak. They feel very individual,
Mm-hmm.
and the reason I give it such high compliments are because you don't always in comics find writers that are so invested in character to that level, where the dialogue is so succinct, the way they speak, how they speak, and that comes through very much in your work. And I'm
I mean,
wondering,
that is, to be honest, that is writing.
yeah,
Um, if you're not paying attention to the words and their delivery and the dialogue, like in a comic book, like what are you doing then? Because that's all there is. That of your work, the only thing that makes it out to the reader is your dialogue and your narrative captions. And if you're not paying attention to the words that you're using there and how you're delivering them and how you're putting them on the page,
mm,
I think that is an opportunity missed because good plotting is different from good writing.
yeah, you're right.
There are a lot of good plotters. It takes a lot more work to be a good writer,
Mm,
and good writers can get away with bad plotting. Great plotters cannot get away with bad writing.
that's true. They say, and I guess I'm perhaps falsely equating plot with ideas, but they say that ideas are cheap. Execution is the price to pay. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I'm going a step further. Even once you had the idea, there's ways of executing it, but certainly with comics, I think there's a tendency to focus on like what's happening, what's on this page, how
yes.
much action is there. All that's great. Those are all things everyone should focus on. but you're a writer. The only thing that you're going to leave on the page that will sustain, that will stay in while the comic book is in print, are the words that you put inside those balloons, are the words that you put in those narration boxes. And so your words have to be chosen well.
That is music to my ears. I love hearing that, because again, I've definitely noticed the same thing, and you know, I mean, I'm not old. I mean, I'm 23, and obviously as a young adult reading comic books, that's sort of always a constant frustration of this sort of perception of comics, is that they're only capable of doing these big crisis events and bright colors and boom and pow. And I'm constantly, I feel like I'm yelling into the ether about how comic books are not just that. They're a medium, not so much as a genre. And you can and should, and I encourage it, to be concerned about the characters more than anything else, because that's what drives people. I mean, the likes of these DC Comics characters are sort of the last vestige of, or the only vestige of an American mythological pantheon to a degree. I mean, we don't sing of them as if they're real, but they maintain that level of iconicity. And so I'm
Sure.
always a proponent of being focused on them as characters, because everything around them will come as long as you focus on that.
Sure. And I'm not in disagreement at all. I think though it's important to remember that these are commercial things with corporations behind them, and so there is a need to be risk averse. There's a need to use formulas to put things down on paper that say that, look, this is how we do it because this is how we've done it in the past. Unfortunately, stories don't work that way. You can't. The moment you find a formula, that thing is dead. And so yeah, I'm not in disagreement at all. I think characters and icons become characters and icons because someone wrote them well enough for them to become characters and icons. And this is true of comic books or the great sort of mythological epics, if you will. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, without taking too much of your time up, I think that's a really great way to kind of lead us out into the night. So I'm really appreciative of your time and
my pleasure.
being so sort of considerate. And yeah, this was selfishly, this was as much for me as it was presenting something for an audience, because I feel like as an aspiring writer, somebody who, just in all transparency, looks up to the work that you do, like, if it's any compliment, is that I study things like Blue and Green, like Savage Shores, so on and so forth, as if maybe you might have studied the Vertigo tales, of
Sure.
the 90s. So selfishly, I also want to thank you, for creating and for being open to having these types of conversations.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to hear that, and I'm very aware of the fact that that's how storytelling works and how it transmits and how great storytellers are made. It's one of those. It's one of the last things you learn by watching. I know people love doing master classes and coming on YouTube and telling people what to do and how to do it and all of that. But
Mm.
if you there's yet an intangible part of storytelling that you only learn by listening and reading and watching other people tell stories. So
Absolutely. Yeah, there's I found that any good advice I've ever seen or absorbed from a writer that I think is worth their salt is that they acknowledge that there is a way that they do it, but there is an ambiguity surrounding it, because it's
there has to be.
the craft of creating is so
Yeah.
personal.
Yeah, there has to be, and I think more than anything else, part, yes, totally, because it's personal, but also because the whole point of doing it is for me to have fun, and so for me to have fun, I have to reach for and try to do something that is difficult and nebulous and unknown even to me, and so
Mm,
that element of the unknown has to exist in every story.
mm. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's I couldn't agree more. And again, I'm so thankful. Again, I appreciate you for
My
sitting
pleasure.
down.
Thanks
Uh,
for having me.
I hope everybody enjoyed the conversation. I will 100% prompt you guys to go follow Ram on Twitter, the right Ram. You can find his Twitter, link to his Twitter and to his website in the description. I also, quick plug, I was so desperate to find a copy of Black Mamba that I was going all over the internet, and I found your online store where you also host like a print shop as well,
Yeah.
and was able to track down Black Mamba that way. And it's at a steal of a price right now. So I invite everybody to go check that out.
Yeah, it's on I for London Prints if anyone is looking for that. But
yeah. And make sure that you guys go to your local comic book store. Do your best to pick up The Many Deaths of Layla Starr amongst other Ram V works. Blue and Green comes highly recommended for me, a favorite of mine as a music head, as a comic book fan, and as a fan of stories in general. So is there anything else that you might want to let the people know at home that you might be working on, or just give a little bit of a light to any upcoming projects?
Well, the only thing that I have that is announced beyond these is Radio Apocalypse, which comes out from Vault. I believe we will be making an announcement saying that the release schedule is moved a little bit, so look out for that. But yeah, that should be out later this year as well. And then I'm working on a couple of unannounced projects, which, if they're announced, will definitely be on my Twitter feed. So go follow my Twitter feed.
Yeah, definitely go follow him. And thank you, everybody, for watching. This has been a fantastic conversation with the one and only, the inimitable Ram V. Make sure you guys go check his work out, follow him on Twitter, and we'll catch you next time.